Hello and welcome to another video of that other channel I don't want my boss to know about. My name is still David Bos, and as always I want to remain anonymous. After the great success that my Me Too series has been, I'm going to talk about something slightly more harmless today. Or maybe harmless is the wrong word, as I do believe that it has important societal implications. But at least nobody's getting raped. Still, while it is a niche topic, it's a small detail in the big picture that is fundamentally dishonest, and that's why I want to talk about it. Since I don't want this to just be the political rant channel number 1753, I want to broaden the spectrum to topics that tie in more with my specific background, and that is the arts. You might also have noticed that I changed my setup a little bit. I'm using a different mic now, and it's placed differently. Thanks to the great help of a friend whom I would gladly link to if his channel was already online, I hopefully have figured out a way to sound clear and good, while at the same time reducing all those unwanted noises that were still plaguing my Me Too videos. But enough of those pleasantries. Today's topic is about the term cinéma vérité, why the term is fundamentally dishonest, and, more generally speaking, about the notion of objectivity or truth in art in general, whether it's possible, and if so, whether it would actually be desirable. And since I don't want this to become another 1.5 hour video series, let's dive right into it. The ideas for this video came some time ago when I saw a video of Red Letter Media. I think it was a review or a half in the bag episode in which Jay Bauman repeatedly talked about how a specific movie was very vérité and its vérité-like quality. Unfortunately, I can't remember which exact video it was. I thought it was their review of Pink Flamingos, but there's actually only one reference to vérité in it, and that's not even coming from Jay.
Yeah, that's vérité.
So it must have been somewhere else. Regardless, every time I hear vérité, I cringe a little bit, and I have a long-standing aversion against this term for a multitude of reasons. Mostly because it transports wrong ideas about the art, and because at its root it's deeply political and dishonest. Also, I don't like it when the French rebrand something already existing, give it a fancy name and act as if they've invented something new. Actually, I always disliked that, but the French of the 1960s were especially annoying about it. But anyway, first things first. The term vérité, as used commonly these days, such as by the guys of Red Letter Media, is mostly just interpreted as something they did for real in the movie. Something raw and unpolished that makes the viewer doubt whether it's still acting or just doing the thing that is being shown. This mostly applies to low-budget films or documentaries in which certain scenes come across as rather unpolished, though if we're honest, we should probably also apply it to Tom Cruise hanging out of a helicopter, as he's quite known for doing his own stunts and thus the real thing. This meaning is kind of harmless, but it's still annoying to me when the term is used to describe it. Is based on a movement as dishonest and flawed as cinéma vérité. The original term cinéma vérité dates back to France of the 1950s and 60s and is a typical result of the neo-Marxist atmosphere of that time and place. The definitions of what exactly cinéma vérité is vary between sources, though that mostly depends on the in- or exclusion of certain technical elements like voiceover from a narrator. But the key element most everyone agrees on, and which is after all implied in the title itself, is the attempted depiction of quote-unquote truth, as opposed to the established tropes of fiction filmmaking. As generally in the 60s, also here, the established traditions are treated as if they are not adequate anymore to express the sensibilities of their time. In retrospect, it is therefore quite interesting to see how good movies of the 50s can still be considered timeless and enjoyable to us, while a lot of the movies that were expressing the notions of their time are in comparison almost unwatchable these days. While there's nothing wrong with documentary filmmaking, which is the field on which the original vérité movement established itself before the French New Wave adopted many of those ideas as well, it is very manipulative to claim that it is your own cinema that transports the truth. Funnily enough, at the same time, it wasn't really a secret that directors of the vérité movement would construct their movies highly subjective to transport their versions of truth. Which, in itself again, is nothing strange, as we as humans can only approach things subjectively. The problem only arises once you coin a term such as vérité, because by doing so you naturally imply that the subjective truths of others outside of your chosen group aren't really truths. In other words, whether you choose to tell your story by filming a traffic jam enacted by lay actors, or whether you're filming a studio epic with highly paid superstars, we're always dealing with more or less subjective truths, and it is up to us to determine whether what's being presented is at least a result of a critical process of weighing different viewpoints against each other. By claiming that by some formal achievement and a rampant degree of unreflected subjectivity, you are in possession of the truth, is thus a very dangerous assumption to make. But, to quote Steve Jobs, there's more. Because you see, the whole idea isn't even original, it's a rehash of ideas expressed before. Given how popular Marxist ideas were in the 60s, it's actually surprising they didn't make it more obvious where it all came from. But maybe they just wanted to appear more original than they actually were. Or maybe people back then actually knew, and we've just forgotten it because we're an uneducated bunch of know-it-alls these days. That being said, the origins aren't really a secret. Even on Wikipedia, one can find a short reference to where it all stems from, which is the kino-pravda, quite literally the same thing as cinéma vérité but in Russian, which was developed by Dziga Vertov in the 1920s. Still, despite it not being secret, it's a story not really present in public perception nowadays. Dziga Vertov was born as David Abelevich Kaufman into a Jewish family in Białystok in eastern Poland, then part of the Russian Empire. Similar to many of the Bolsheviki, he changed his name early on to a pseudonym, and that is no coincidence, as he shared a lot of the revolutionary ideologies of the Bolsheviki. While not an original revolutionary, he quickly seized the opportunity after the revolution to establish himself within the newly emerging apparatus. The development of a new human is an important part of the Marxist ideology, and also Vertov had similar ideas. His kino-glaz, which means cine-eye, is an idea that the lens of a camera is far more perfect and objective than the human eye, and as such would open humans to a higher level of objective perception. So not only are we talking about subjective truth anymore, Vertov is talking about objectivity, which is a problem unto itself. Vertov also shunned the concept of fiction in cinema, which he considered to be a bourgeois remnant of all the forms of entertainment of the old regime. Instead, he wanted to show reality, the real life, and chose to film everyday situations. While his works are utter propaganda, quite often disgustingly so given his choice of topics, he was certainly a technical visionary and is rightfully considered to be one of the most important pioneers of documentary filmmaking. Nevertheless, aside from his formal achievements, his various concepts such as his kino-pravda, his cinematic truth, and his cine-eye are deeply rooted in Bolshevik ideology, and given the nature of its proclaimed supremacy over bourgeois fiction, you can't separate the art from the underlying ideology. Just imagine for a second the French would have started a cinéma héroïque movement in the 1960s based on the aesthetic achievements of Leni Riefenstahl. I doubt we'd be talking about this casually nowadays. After the Bolsheviki decided that it's not the proletarian cult they want reflected in their art, but instead socialist realism was to celebrate the achievements of the party and its leaders, attention shifted away from Vertov and his experimental visions of filmmaking. He continued producing movies that were technically certainly forward-looking, but ideologically rotten at their core in the 30s. After 1937, he was more or less retired from directing and spent the rest of his days as an editor. Vertov is undoubtedly the father of documentary filmmaking and was the counterpart to Sergei Eisenstein's cinema of fiction. But once the new economic policy kicked in 1921, the tide seemed to turn away from Vertov's radical approach, and Eisenstein became, at least for a period of time, as always in Soviet Russia, the unquestioned champion of Soviet cinema, at least after his famous battleship Potemkin of 1925. So aside from his ideology, what is the exact problem with Vertov's striving for objectivity, which at least in part seems to be more honest and consequent than the attempts of the Frenchman that ripped him off a few decades later? First off, as I already mentioned, his filmmaking is completely politically driven. In fact, it's utter propaganda and doesn't even really try to hide that fact. As such, his truth is the truth of the Bolshevik Party, or at least of some of the factions in it. His documentaries are driven by a propagandistic vision that is pretty much as untrue as it gets. But his idea of the kino-glaz seems to propose objectivity through the means of the camera lens that shows things as they are. Leaving aside the fact that the concept of objectivity in itself is flawed, as it's based on the ideological assumption that the only objective science is dialectic materialism, and that Vertov had found the way to translate this to cinema, the problem here is quite obvious. Even if you show the arrival of a train in a station as something unstaged and objective, the filmmaker has still made a choice to film this very occurrence, which might transport a different story than filming any other random event taking place at the same time. Pointing the camera in one direction or the other can already make a huge difference in perception. Who makes that choice, if not the filmmaker? The lens certainly doesn't. As anybody who has looked a bit into filmmaking knows, there are dozens of factors contributing to the look and feel of a scene, even though it's always the same thing being shown. Only because there aren't paid actors in front of the camera, but unpaid proletarians, doesn't really make a difference for that, except for the fact that it saves some money. As such, there is no objective truth that can be seen, or at least none that has meaning for us. It is only the subjective choices about camera placement, location choice, editing points, etc. that transport meaning to us and fill us with a feeling about what's taking place. Another point of critique about Vertov is actually that he, like many of the filmmakers of the cinéma vérité movement later on, broke his own rules if it fit his purposes, which again was usually politically motivated. Some of his best-known work, such as The Man with the Cinema Camera, contains a series of staged scenes which contradicts many of the principles Vertov had on paper. It really is a case of preaching water and drinking wine. With regards to the question of whether objectivity would be possible at all in cinema, and in extension in all of art, but for now I'm going to stick with cinema, I want to postpone the philosophical discussion about the validity of the concept itself to another video and instead share an easy example based on the terms that Vertov uses that illustrates this quite well. This here is a 360 degrees camera, a Ricoh Theta, as many people have one nowadays, and 360 videos even exist on YouTube. A 360-degree camera might be a dream come true for Vertov, considering his visions about kino-glaz. The 360-degree camera eliminates the filmmaker's choice of where to point the camera, as it points everywhere and gives the viewer the freedom to look anywhere he wants. That being said, who knows whether a propagandist such as Vertov would have really liked it if the choice of where to point the camera was actually taken away from him. Still, if we run with this for a moment, we still bump inevitably into lots of other problems, because there's still the element of where you place the camera. What are you going to film? At what time? Are you going to edit the footage in some way? Because all of these decisions are subjective and thus incompatible with the idea of objectivity. As such, the only way to achieve something objective would be to have a worldwide array of 360-degree cameras filming continuously every single part of the world and being fed into one giant consciousness. It would essentially be God vision. But even then, there'd be a problem, because in a semiotic process, the information always still needs to be decoded by the audience, in this case the viewer. And as we aren't divine, and even the most advanced teenage girls can't do more than 5 things simultaneously next to typing on their phone, we'll always be stuck with having to make a choice what bit of information we are processing. So, it is inevitable that we have to make a choice in what information to process, as it is the only way for us to attribute value and meaning to it. By making these choices, we have the ability to actively shape our perception, but also to be actively aware of this very process. And by knowing this, we in turn gain the ability to put our own perception in question, thus opening ourselves up to other viewpoints. It is this process that allows us to approach a sense of meaningful objectivity, an idea of how things really are, as a sum of subjective impressions that are consciously weighed against each other. I'm honestly not quite sure whether Vertov really didn't see how faulty his logic was, or whether he knew but decided to proceed with it nevertheless, because it was his unique selling point, his branding, his career as a Soviet filmmaker. And as to the French filmmakers of the 60s and their cinéma vérité, their logic was either just as faulty or, like Vertov, they were more interested in furthering the cause of their ideology while establishing themselves as prophets of this very process. Since Marxism and all sorts of other left-wing isms were en vogue in the 1960s, they quite obviously found it rather unproblematic to copy the ideologically rooted principles of talented propagandists from one of the most inhuman regimes the 20th century has seen. Am I to respect or even admire this? It's one thing to give a certain degree of credit to Vertov for his technical contributions to this young art form. But half a century later in France, this is nothing but a rebranding of an old idea, a rehash of an ideology heavily linked to aggressive propaganda, which is used to establish themselves as apostles of truth, as dictators of opinion. To produce highly subjective movies and to proclaim that your cinema is the cinema of truth is a blatant lie, nothing but an attempt to claim authority of what is truth or not, while at the same time distorting the very meaning of the word. And what is left of it nowadays? Well, Jean-Luc Godard, even though not a real member of the Cinéma Vérité but of the Nouvelle Vague, is still making highly unwatchable movies to this day. Not that I think that many people are watching them anyway, but apparently he has a status that allows him to keep putting out propagandistic drivel and even receiving prizes for it. It is not very surprising that Godard, who was and is one of the most politically outspoken and misguided directors, had started a group of Maoist filmmakers in the 70s called the Dziga Vertov group.
Pouvez me dire comment vous voyez votre travail pour le moment avec votre équipe qui est là?
Bon ben pour l'instant, le premier travail, ça va consister à ce que tu nous fasses un chèque que nous donne la télévision allemande.
Im Augenblick besteht unsere Arbeit darin, dass du uns einen Scheck ausstellst vom deutschen Fernsehen, das von den Zionisten subventioniert wird. Für uns, die wir einen Film über Palästina machen wollen, besteht die Arbeit darin, dass wir versuchen, den Zionisten Geld abzunehmen, damit wir Waffen kaufen können, um sie anzugreifen. Darum stellst du uns einen Scheck aus. Das Fernsehen hat die Angewohnheit vom Imperialismus übernommen, Leute, mit denen man arbeitet, nicht zu bezahlen. Aber wir arbeiten, nicht nur ich, sondern auch mein Team, und das bringt Unkosten mit sich. Darum stellst du uns jetzt einen Scheck vom deutschen Fernsehen aus. Jetzt solltet ihr den Scheck filmen. Und das Interessante dabei ist, dass dieses Geld den Zionisten jetzt fehlt und ihren Verbündeten, den deutschen Demokraten, wie heißt der doch, dieser Brandt und Konsorten. Du kannst deine Kontonummer angeben, nur zu. Selbstverständlich soll dieser Scheck keinem von euch vom Gehalt abgezogen werden. Sollte das der Fall sein, dann sagt es uns und wir zahlen euch den entsprechenden Anteil zurück.
Alors pour votre travail que vous faites maintenant pour
Chacun peut se le passer de temps en temps devant le visage.
d'après les journaux.
Non, et puis on pense qu'il faudrait quand même. Car
Warte, Jean-Luc Godard war ein Autor, ist es immer noch und versucht dafür zu kämpfen, kein Autor zu sein. Es ist schwierig. Ihr solltet also damit aufhören, mich in Großaufnahme zu filmen, nur weil ich rede, sondern auch die Zuhörenden filmen und dann uns alle in der Totalen, denn wir versuchen als Gruppe zu arbeiten und Gruppenarbeit ist politische Arbeit.
Travailler en groupe, c'est un travail politique. Et qu'il n'y a pas.
Qu'au minimum, s'il y a un nom prononcé.
Wenn du jetzt eine Totale machen könntest von uns vieren, basta aus.
Tu filmes les quatre si tu veux, et puis on reste comme ça.
That really pretty much says it all. Nowadays, there are many people in the arts and surrounding them that flirt quite openly again with these ideologies and want to sell us another rebranded version of these ideas that haven't worked for the past 100 years. And almost always, they are stressing the visionary aspects of somebody such as Dziga Vertov. So, the next time somebody mentions Vertov to you or rambles on about cinema vérité, you will know better than to believe this propaganda. So now you know why I cringe every time I hear somebody talk about a movie or certain scenes being vérité. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Please feel free to leave a comment that's vaguely linked to the topic at hand, and while you're at it, please like and subscribe to my channel. While the outstanding success of my Me Too series has me still bouncing up and down counting the viewing numbers, I will admit that I'm always looking to grow. See you next time.